Admonition the 7th. Connect at the deepest level. 4 months later, as we slowed past the still quivering for sale sign, it became apparent that the drive head widened to the road in a north-facing slantwise trumpet, its furthest extent described on either side by 2 standing stones. I noted, as we turned in, that these monoliths, embosomed as they were in cedar, yew and dank rhododendron, had metal hinges inserted into their opposing faces, as if awaiting, or as if having lost, a set of double gates. Rusted, greening and lichen-covered, the hinges, the old stones, the encroaching vegetation spoke to a bone-deep, decades-long neglect, one which we were to find in the building, notwithstanding the ruinous fire, and in the grounds, and with the bridge. Something in me settled then. Call it a knowing, that whatever we were to find at the bottom of this drive, it was already familiar, already something with which I could connect, if I so chose. At this point, if asked, I would have said I had a choice, but there were deeper, older forces at work. One such relates to a cousin of mine. Oh no, bear with me. Well, I have several cousins, all of them well loved, but of my cousins, one in particular, Angus, becomes relevant at this point, and my brother Tom. But it is Angus who mostly comes to mind in this, given that he was, and remains to this day, a first-class troublemaker. On my father's side, we cousins spent many long weeks in the summer holidays down in Cornwall, on the south coast. At the utmost end of a long and winding lane, there is a turning through double gates hung between granite dykes and are shaded by huge gnarled cedar, yew and rhododendron. That sounds rather familiar now that I describe it. Not that I recognised it either that day at Dunans or later when Sadie and I took the dogs down to Port Navis. As your car inches through this very Cornish gateway and bottoms out on the slope that takes you down to the flat area where you park, you are confronted with a spectacular view of an estuary over a sloping meadow. Then, once parked, you sit for at least 5 minutes in an involuntary pause, windows down, looking at that view, silent, entranced, by the sea, the surf, the gulls, the wildflowers and the plenitude of honeybees and red admirals, by being in such a perfectly formed environment. Every year we'd go down, as the families always had from before the Second World War onwards. To begin with, there was a house, and then, when Granny Duck sold the building at its grounds in 74, there was the field, a meadow, occasionally hosting donkeys, sitting a little to the front and downhill of the holiday home. As children, we would often walk along the dry stone wall between, picking blackberries and looking up wonderingly at the arts and craft frontage where once we stayed as newborns, with our parents, in actual bedrooms, with an actual bath and an actual loo. One year in particular, a couple of days before we were all to leave, 3 of us, myself, Tom and Angus, were making our usual afternoon collection along the wall, and Angus made a suggestion. "We should buy the house back for the family one day." "We should," I replied, immediately warming to the idea. "And Eldonell." "Right." "Well, what about Massingham?" asked Tom. "Oh, Massingham too, definitely," thought Angus. "Do you think the nuns would sell?" I asked. "To us? Defo." Angus was always sure of these things, of the surety of family over the world and its inconsistencies. "Well then, that's a plan," I said. "But who buys what?" There was the question, and here we entered into a very serious and deeply detailed discussion about who would own which, for the family, obviously. We decided Tom would have Eldonell because he'd spent time there with Granny, and Angus would have Tristana because it was his idea mostly, and I would have Massingham because neither of the others wanted to live in Norfolk, and I rather fancied what I remembered of the dark panelled abode of our great-grandparents. "Let's make a pact!" exclaimed Angus excitedly when the deal was agreed. "A pact?" Tom and I looked at one another uncertainly. "Cut our palms and shake. Seal it in blood." "What, all 3 of us?" asked Tom. "Look, I've got my knife." Angus brandished his brand new Swiss Army knife. It shone menacingly in the sun, lugworm ichor still apparent along its length. "Taffy would go mental," I said. "Your mum would go mental," Tom said to Angus. We didn't mention ours. Our mum would probably just roll her eyes, slather the cuts with Savlon, cuff the back of our heads, and send us out with a curt, "Don't get dirt in the cuts." If we mentioned our mum, Angus would become even more gung-ho. "Yeah, but it's a blood promise. Don't care what they say." I didn't want to be a wimp, but I really wasn't up for cutting my palm. My fingers were still smarting from being jabbed several times when I was threading luggies onto my fish hook that morning. I couldn't think of anything worse than a proper cut. I could see Tom was similarly uncomfortable. I searched frantically for anything that would prevent bloodshed. Angus started to sharpen his blade on a stone in the wall beside us. "You don't need to do that," said Tom. "Has to be very sharp, hurts less." "What about lockjaw?" I asked. "I've got matches. Burn any bugs off. Make the wound clean too. Seal it." I swore mentally. Well, at least I thought I was swearing. My sweary vocabulary included words which weren't exactly offensive. Bum, for example, and willies, and rudo. That last was Angus's from the night before in our hammocks under the cherry and white canvas of the big tent, before we got to the ghost stories. By now, I was really quite worried. This was a matter of family honour, and I couldn't back down. But then I realised that that might be the answer. "But we're cousins, Angus. We share blood anyway." "Right, Chig-Chog, we're cousins, Gus," ventured Tom, and then said mischievously, "We've got the same bloody blood." We fell about laughing at that. After 5 fine minutes, in which we tortured each other with more helpless giggling, shouting, "Bloody blood!" at the top of our high, fluting voices, we managed to get serious again. "Hadn't thought of that. You're right, Chig. Cousins, no blood needed." I think I glimpsed relief in his face as Angus pocketed his knife and matches. "Maybe we should just spit on our hands and shake," I said. "All right, but no greenies." "Right, no greenies. I was famous for my greenies that year." We spat. We shook. Our fates were sealed. Well, my fate was sealed. Not sure about Angus, nor Tom. It may be they're both playing a longer, more sensible strategic game. All of this was implied by the settling in myself, in the all too brief seconds it took to turn the car down into the tunnel of yews, Sitka rhododendron and cotoneaster. I knew this approach, this neglect, this context. I'd seen it, smelt it, touched it, in Cornwall, in Norfolk, on the fen. Now it was at the head of this drive, which led we knew not to what.